Hey everybody, it's Mike. It's Sunday. It's July 23rd, 2023, and I have a new presentation to take everybody through. The last presentation I did was the addendum. Did the Beatles write all their own music? And that goes back to April, so about 3 months ago. Now, before I take you through the table of contents, let's call our attention over to the image on the right-hand side of the chart, and we can see that Paul McCartney has a birdcage over his head. And there are similar images with George Harrison and John Lennon. And the birdcage is Illuminati symbolism for mind control. And there are plenty of images on the internet that show the Beatles displaying occulted symbolism. For example, if you know what you're looking for, you'll see images of the Beatles displaying one-eyed symbolism, Masonic handshakes, the hidden hand, the lion's paw, etc. And what I'll do at the end of this presentation is to put a little slideshow together with images of the Beatles displaying occulted symbolism. Now, there's actually two things going on with this image. So we have Paul with the birdcage over his head, and as I mentioned, that's Illuminati symbolism for mind control. But we also have George putting his index finger across Paul's lips, which is the Masonic symbol for tell no secrets. And if we take a look at the Beatles' second UK release, With the Beatles, which was released on November 22nd, 1963, it's the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and November 22nd is an occulted day because if we add the month and the day together, 11 plus 22, we get 33. And of course, 33 is representative of the 33 degrees within the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And the album cover itself is occulted. We have one-eyed symbolism through the shadow effect. Okay, so if we go back to the table of contents, the first thing I would like to do is to thank everyone and anyone who has forwarded me links and images over time, which has helped me to pull together not only this presentation, but prior presentations and also future presentations. Okay, so the first thing we're going to cover is Billy's artificial eye. I'm going to give a little bit of a tutorial, but more importantly, I'm going to show you some confirming clues that Billy is indeed blind in his right eye, and he sees with his left. Then I'm going to play a clip of Glenn Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew. He had a show going back to 1968, and I think this was his debut show. And he's introducing Cream, which of course is Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker. And his introduction is very interesting, so we'll take a listen to that. Then I'm going to talk a bit about UK studio musicians and who some of these players are. And then I'll move to an early Led Zeppelin interview. And it's a very interesting clip because it talks about the death of the personality cult. And in this interview, they're tying the personality cult to the Beatles, with Led Zeppelin being a new type of listening experience. Then I'm going to talk about how Parlophone EMI has occulted imagery hidden in plain sight. And in this case, it's on the central label of their 33 RPM records. In fact, they're 45s as well. And I would like to thank Jimmy Howe, 7883, one of my listeners and subscribers, for noting this. It was very astute. Then I'm going to show you how Help and George's Brainwashed album both contain very obvious occult symbolism. But you have to know what you're looking for, so I will point it out. Then I'm going to talk about the Egyptian god Set and how he is embedded in the Beatles and Billy. And then I have an article on artificial intelligence and a brand new Beatles song. We'll talk a little bit more about Vivian Stanshall because I'm going to cover Stanshall a little bit with Billy's artificial eye. That's topic number 1. Then we'll move to an image that I found that shows Billy's feet, and we're going to talk a little bit about Billy's toes. And then last but not least, I'm going to take you through an article I found in AARP, which is a magazine for retired people in the U.S., and the article was about 50 years of hip-hop and how it became a worldwide movement. And what I'm going to show you is how hip-hop is nothing more than another engineered lifestyle, and genre of music. Okay, so with that, let's move to slide number 2 and talk about Billy's eye. Okay, so this is a slide that was originally in my 2019 presentation where I did my Stanshall analysis. And the reason why I did that presentation is because in Memoirs, Billy makes the claim that he played the Vivian Stanshall character in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. And so I decided that I would take a look and see if that claim was true. And as I was doing the work, I noticed that the McCartney character and the Stanshall character had this same anomaly with the left eye. It appeared lazy and it had a slight drift to the left. And so I had to ask myself, if these were truly two different people, then what are the odds that they would have the same anomaly with their eyes? And I concluded that, well, the odds would be very, very low if they were two different people. But if they were the same person, then the odds would be very high because, well, they're the same person. Now, even if we set the eyes aside for now, if you just take a look at these two images, I mean, it struck me right away that they look like the same person. The only difference is that the guy on the left is an older version of the guy on the right. Look at the facial structure, the shape of the face, the hair. The nose is going to be different, and I'll talk about this a little bit more 2 slides from now. And that's because Billy has had nose surgery and other surgical procedures to make him look more like McCartney and less like himself. But as time has gone on, the fillers and all that stuff, they don't hold together as well. So now going back to the eye, you can see here where his eye, as McCartney, is drifting a little left. And we can see the same thing here with the Stanshall character. A little left. The right eye is looking straight forward in both pictures. But the left eye is not in sync. And so back in October of 2022, Sally Whitty, who is a colleague, a friend, and a very good researcher, who, by the way, also has an ocular prosthesis, except her artificial eye is her left eye, not the right, like Billy's. She was examining images of Billy and taking a look at how his eyes moved and how sometimes they didn't move together in sync. And she concluded, and I believe correctly, because I think that this is a fact, and I'm going to show you in a moment how Billy has confirmed Sally's discovery, that he is blind in his right eye, and he only has sight in his left. So Sally's discovery of Billy's artificial eye, to me, is the most significant and tangible evidence that Billy is not Paul. Because Paul didn't have a prosthetic eye. He had 2 good eyes. So what I'm going to do is to move to slide number 3, and I'm going to show you, I believe definitively, that there is something going on with Billy's eyes. If you can't see it here, I'm positive you'll see it with the next slide, and once you see it, no pun intended, you cannot unsee it. And also, the link to the presentation I did with Sally on the eye going back to October of last year is in the description box below. Right here is the splash screen, so if you see that video, that's the presentation. Okay, so let's move to slide number 3. Okay, so this is slide number 3, and it is a version of a chart that Sally and I presented in the presentation going back to October of 2022, which broke the news that Billy has an ocular prosthesis or an artificial eye. He's blind in his right eye. And what we did was to take the images from the previous chart and then to mask off half the face. Mask off the left-hand side of the face, the right-hand side of the face for both images. And once you do that, it's a lot easier to see that his eyes are not in sync. So let's take a look at image number 1. So here we have Billy in his McCartney role. He's older. We can see that his right eye is looking straight ahead. Then when we move over to image number 2 and we mask off the right-hand side of his face, which is on our left, we can see that his left eye is not looking straight ahead. It drifts left. So the right eye is looking straight forward and the left eye is drifting slightly to the left. Then when we move over to image number 3, he's in his Stanshall role. He's playing the Vivian Stanshall character. And we can see that his right eye is looking straight at us. Then when we look at image number 4, we can see that his left eye is looking slightly left, just as it does in image number 2, where Billy's playing his McCartney role. So image number 1 and image number 3, they sync up. The eye is looking straight ahead, and by the way, again, his right eye is his blind eye. That's the eye with the ocular prosthesis. And if we look at image number 2 and 4, we can see that his left eye, which is on our right, in both images, his left eye is wandering or drifting slightly left. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, once you see this, you cannot unsee it. And as you look at images of Billy, you'll see this. Now, I should also note, his eyes are not always out of sync. You will look at images and you will see video where his eyes are moving together. But you're also going to see images and video where they do not. Now, some folks have come forth and they have said, well, I don't think that artificial eyes move. And that is incorrect. So I took this information from a website out of the UK that does artificial eyes, and let me read that. Some people are surprised to find that their artificial eye moves. Although it may not have as complete a set of movements as a normal eye, your artificial eye should have good, acceptable movements. Your artificial eye will move with its partner and should not move of its own accord. The exact degree of movement will vary between person to person depending upon how much muscle is left after the surgery and if it is still in good condition. I'll drop this link down below in a description box, but there are plenty of medical websites that say the exact same thing. Okay, now let's move to slide number 4 and let's do another comparison between Billy, this time a younger version of him as McCartney, against this image of Vivian Stanshall. Okay, so this time we're going to compare a younger version of Billy in his McCartney role against the Stanshall image. And as you do this, I highly recommend that you pause the video and inspect both images. And notice the overall facial structure, the jawline, the mouth, the mustache, which is exactly the same in both images, and even to a degree, the ear, even though it's a little more difficult to discern. If we go to the image on the left, we can see Billy has this crease along the ridge of his left ear. And when I look at the Stanshall image on the right, it's a little more difficult to see, but I detect that crease right here as well. But most importantly is the overall facial structure, the jawline, the mouth, and so on. We should also note that surgery has altered the nose to make it narrower in the image on the left. So in his McCartney role, we can see that the nose is slightly narrower, especially here by the nostrils. However, we still have the creases near the nostrils going toward the top part of the mustache in both images. Now, with the eyes, even though they have a similar shape, they are not identical. And why is that? It's because Billy had a surgical procedure known as a blepharoplasty. A blepharoplasty, or a bleph, is a procedure that surgically removes excess fat, muscle, and skin from the upper and lower eyelids to redefine the shape of the eye. That's very important. A blepharoplasty redefines the shape of the eye. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because there have been comments where people have questioned how the eyes were able to be reshaped. And that's the process, a blepharoplasty. Also with the eyes, if we go back to what the eyes do and don't do, we can see in both images that his right eye is looking straight forward. And in both images, again, even in this image with Billy in the role of McCartney when he's younger, we can see that his left eye is not looking straight forward. It has a slight drift to the left. Okay, so this guy on the left and this guy on the right are the same person. Now, if we move to the image to the far right, this is another picture of Stanshall. It's a screen capture I took from a Bonzo Dog Band video, and in this image he is younger than he is in the larger image, maybe by about 2 or 3 years or so is my guess. And we can see his hair is shorter and he does not have a mustache. It's very difficult to come by images of Billy in his Stanshall character without a mustache, but we have this one here. And even in this image, we can see his eyes are not tracking together. His right eye, the eye that he is blind in, appears to be drifting off to the right and not in sync with his left eye. So when the eyes are not in alignment, when they're not tracking together, it's because the right eye, the eye that he is blind in, is not tracking with his left. And we can see this here even in an earlier image of Billy in his Stanshall role. Now, later on in the presentation, I'm going to show you some compares using this image, the younger version of Stanshall, comparing that to Billy's son, James McCartney. And you are going to see an uncanny similarity. And in Memoirs, Billy tells us that if you want to know what he looked like before all the surgeries, look at his son, James. And if you don't want to look at James, and you want to know what Billy looked like before the surgeries, look at his Stanshall character. This is him. That's what he looked like before he transformed into the Paul McCartney role. Okay, so with that, let's now take a look at some clues that Billy has dropped that validate and confirm Sally's discovery that he is blind in his right eye. Okay, so this is an image that I put up on my community tab on my Paul is Dead YouTube channel a few weeks ago. And it's Billy with Pudsey Bear. And Pudsey Bear is the official logo of Children in Need. Children in Need is the BBC's UK charity. And since 1980, it has raised over £1.5 billion for disadvantaged children and young people in the UK. Now, one of the things that I have learned about Billy over the last 7 years is anything that he does publicly, especially when it's scripted and staged, as an example, this photo, he's always dropping clues. Always. So I'm looking at this image and I'm asking myself, what is he trying to communicate out? Meaning, aside from promoting children in need, is he giving us a hidden clue about himself? So let's take a look. Pudsey has Pythagorean numerology of 9. 9 is also the number associated with Billy when he is playing his McCartney role. Pudsey has a patch over his right eye. Billy is blind in his right eye. Pudsey is wearing Billy's Sgt. Pepper costume. So the question is Pudsey, as depicted in this image, a representation of Billy? So let me explain. Is Billy telling us he was also a child in need as a result of childhood trauma-based programs that possibly resulted in the loss of his right eye? Now, for those of you that have not read memoirs or have not followed my work, in memoirs, Billy tells us, through Tom Harriet, who's the author/encoder, that his earliest recollection of being in a trauma-based mind control program goes back to when he was 3 years old. And for those of us who have researched these trauma-based programs, we know that ritual abuse goes hand in hand. So with this image, is Billy telling us that he lost the sight in his right eye due to ritual abuse because of the trauma-based programs that he was in as a child? And personally, I think it's very possible that that is exactly what he's trying to tell us. Also, the red shoes or the red feet has to be symbolic of something, and I'm taking a guess here, but red is often associated with sun worship, which would go back to Egypt, which would go back to Horus. And again, I'm taking a guess here, but there's a reason why Pudsey's feet are front and center. So if anybody has any additional insight, please comment below in the comment section. Okay, so with that, we'll leave on a lighter note. We can see that behind Billy's left shoulder, there's a magic mushroom. And like I said, he's always leaving clues. Okay, so let's now move to slide number 6, and I'm going to show you a clip from an interview that Billy did with CBS. CBS is one of the major television networks in the U.S., and he masterfully speaks and drops a very significant clue about his eye. Okay, so this is going to be short and sweet. I will play the clip through twice. The big reveal takes place toward the end when Billy masterfully speaks and tells us very clearly that he only has sight in his left eye, meaning he's blind in his right. The backdrop again is Billy, in his McCartney role, is being interviewed by CBS about the Eyes of the Storm photo exhibit. The Eyes of the Storm photo exhibit consists of photographs that were allegedly taken by Paul McCartney going back into the early days. And Billy is chatting with the interviewer, going through the gallery, giving his recollection of the photos, which of course is comical because he's not Paul McCartney and he was not there. But that is what Billy is really good at, telling stories. So let's take a listen to the clip.
This picture was when we were arriving at, I think it was the Deauville Hotel in Miami.
I think your quote in the book was, "I can almost hear her scream."
Yeah, you can't. The cop's got to restrain her, you know.
Well, I also love the cop in the foreground who just sort of looks puzzled by everything.
I know.
Yeah.
I like the architecture.
So do I.
Of that
I actually
hotel.
love it.
But, you know, as we were saying before, that had to be taken really quickly.
Yeah.
Just had to snap that.
Yeah. But you have to have an eye to take that.
It's my left one.
Bam. Let's take a listen to it again.
This picture was when we were arriving at, I think it was the Deauville Hotel in Miami.
I think your quote in the book was, "I can almost hear her scream."
Yeah, you can't. The cop's got to restrain her, you know.
Well, I also love the cop in the foreground who just sort of looks puzzled by everything.
I know.
Yeah.
I like the architecture.
So do I.
Of that
I actually
hotel.
love it.
But, you know, as we were saying before, that had to be taken really quickly.
Yeah.
Just had to snap that.
Yeah. But you have to have an eye to take that.
It's my left one.
There you go. It doesn't get any clearer than that. And the footnotes in memoirs have been updated to validate Sally's discovery that Billy is blind in his right eye. So there you go. All right, so with that, let's move to chart 7 and let's take a listen to how Glen Campbell introduces Cream back in 1968. Okay, so this clip was sent to me by a listener, and I posted it to my community tab on my Paul is Dead channel going back several weeks ago. And I believe this clip, when you hear it, is going to open your eyes because I put it into the category of evidence that the Beatles did not play on all of their recorded tracks, that many of these tracks were recorded with session players. And so Glen Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew, was introducing Cream, who of course is Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce, to his audience, and they're going to play Sunshine of Your Love. And I'm not going to play the song, I'm just going to focus on Glen's intro. And Glen does this introduction on July 14th, 1968. So let me read what I wrote at the top of the chart. Glen Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew, introduces Cream on July 14th, 1968, and states they are studio musicians and played on tracks for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, etc. Glen's introduction was 2 months before Eric Clapton was asked by George Harrison to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And if we go to Wikipedia and take a look at what it says about While My Guitar Gently Weeps, under the header overdubs, it tells us that George Harrison asked Eric to play guitar on the track on September 6th of 1968. So here we have Glen introducing Cream and saying that they played on tracks for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, etc. 2 months before we're told that George Harrison asked Eric to play guitar on the track. Therefore, unless Glen Campbell had a crystal ball, it is highly unlikely Campbell was referring specifically to Eric Clapton playing on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Logic would conclude he was referring to members of Cream playing on Beatle tracks in general. Okay, so with that, let's take a listen to how Glen introduces Cream. And again, he's introducing Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce.
The three guys you're about to meet were at one time considered to be three of the finest studio musicians in England. And they played on most of the English acts records like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Donovan, Smothers Brothers, and probably everyone else that come from England, you know.
And they played on most of the English acts records like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Donovan, Smothers Brothers, and probably everyone else that come from England, you know.
They were considered the cream of the crop of their profession. Well, I need a new mouth tonight. So they figured that they were so much in demand that they'd just start their own thing. So they did. They started their own thing. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cream. Here they are.
They played on most of the English acts records like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Donovan, Smothers Brothers, and probably everyone else that come from England, you know.
So there you go. And I should also mention that Memoirs alludes to Glen himself playing on Beatle tracks. Now, this clip may help us to fill in some other blanks. If we go back to the Bernard Purdie interview that he did back in 2004, and that interview is in my presentation, The Addendum, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And I'll put the link down below if you want to catch that interview. He tells us that between 1962 and 1966, there were 4 drummers on Beatles songs, and Ringo was not one of them. So, who were the 4 drummers? Well, we know that Bernard, for 45 years, has been saying that he drummed on 21 tracks himself. We know that Andy White drummed on at least 2 songs, P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do, That's per the official narrative. I suspect that Andy White drummed on a lot more songs than just those two. I have expressed to my audience that going back 3 years ago, I was contacted by a relative of the late, great jazz and studio drummer Ronnie Verrill, and the family member told me that Ronnie drummed on Beatle tracks. And so that's three. There's Bernard, there's Andy White, and there's Ronnie Verrill. So who's the fourth? Well, perhaps the fourth drummer could have been Ginger Baker. Now, another blank that this clip could possibly fill in, and this is my own personal perspective. If we go back to the interview that Billy, aka Paul McCartney, did with Rick Rubin, where Rick is talking about the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and then isolates the bass track, and then starts talking about the tone and the aggressiveness of the track, Billy's reaction is that of somebody that did not lay down that bass track. It came across to me as if he was not the bass player for that song. So the question in my mind after watching this clip is perhaps based upon Billy's reaction, because he offered no insight into the tone, the reason for the type of playing, none of that. It was as if he was in spectator mode. He was just listening. I started to think after I watched this clip that maybe the bass player on While My Guitar Gently Weeps was Jack Bruce. Why not? Eric Clapton played lead. You know? And then maybe we could take it a step further and ask, was it really Ringo on the drums? I don't know. I'll let you guys and gals decide. Okay, so with that, since we're on the topic of studio musicians, let's move to slide number 8 and discuss notable UK 1960s studio musicians. Okay, so let's take a moment and dig into notable UK 1960s studio musicians. I'm sourcing the information from an article that was written by Gordon Thompson, and Gordon is the author of the book Please Please Me, 60s British Pop Inside and Out. Now, for those of you that follow my work, you know that I talk a lot about the Wrecking Crew model, and sometimes, based upon feedback that I receive from the comments section, I think that some of my UK listeners think that what I'm saying is that the Wrecking Crew was not only responsible for the backing tracks for pop music in the 1960s and 70s in the US, but also across the pond in the UK. And that's not what I'm saying. When I talk about the Wrecking Crew model, I'm referring to a model. It's an approach. And I have talked about UK studio players that I believe are on Beatle tracks. For example, I've talked about Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick, Jimmy Page, Ronnie Verrill, and some of these names are also here on this chart. So let's take a moment and hear what Gordon has to say. Like Los Angeles, for example, the Wrecking Crew, London boasted a network of recording studios associated not only with popular music, but also with film. An orchestral musician might participate in a film scoring session in the afternoon and be reading through an arrangement by George Martin for Cilla Black at night if they were not already engaged in a theater pit. But the core of London's profitable popular music industry depended on various combinations of guitars, basses, keyboards, and drums, often with backing singers on hand. Session guitarists such as Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick, Jimmy Page, sometimes called Little Jim, Joe Moretti, Brian Daly, and Joe Brown all began playing in bands until their technique, knowledge, and sound brought them to the attention of producers and of contractors. Bassists such as Alan Wagle, Herbie Flowers, John Paul Jones, Eric Ford, and Ron Prentice established their reputations as live performers before becoming denizens of the sunless world of recording studios. Producers turned to drummers like Bobby Graham, Clem Catini, Ronnie Verrill, and Andy White because they had learned how to read music, how to hold a band together on stage, and when to play, and when not. In the first half of the 60s, production crews and musicians generally presumed that in a 3-hour session, excluding setup, a singer and musicians would be able to produce at least 4 completed recordings. Allowing a few hours for musicians to find the right groove did not figure as part of the schedule, unless stars like the Beatles were involved. Let me read that again. Allowing a few hours for musicians to find the right groove for a song did not figure as part of the schedule, unless stars like the Beatles were involved. Now, what this sentence is telling me, the way I'm interpreting it, is that the Beatles recorded album tracks and their 45s were recorded with studio players. The difference being, with other artists, the session players came in, they played to the sheet music, they packed up, and they went to their next gig. However, with the Beatles, because of the importance of the Beatles, they were given more latitude and flexibility to rehearse and find a groove. And by doing that, it gives the song distinction. It gives it personality. Gives it perhaps a little more flair. That's my take on it. Okay, so with that, let's move to slide number 9 and let's talk about Eric Clapton and his session work. Alrighty, so I'm going to run through this slide very quickly. The reason why I included it in the presentation is because whenever I talk about session players, I bring Eric Clapton into the fold. And Eric is a very important player in the studio musician world. Some folks didn't know that. I received a comment or two where they just viewed Eric within the context of his own albums, not realizing that it goes way beyond that. And so I found this article, which is dated. And the reason I know that is because the timeline goes from 1964 through 2005 and tells us that Eric participated in 151 sessions within that time period, 1964 through 2005. And we know that Eric has done a lot of work, both his own material and working with others, since 2005. But the article tells us that from his earliest days as a professional musician, Eric has played on sessions for dozens of artists for their solo projects. His first guest session was in May of 1964 for Otis Spann. Eric's session work has gone through periods of lesser activity, but it has never stopped. The most intriguing thing is perhaps the wide variety of musicians and genres he has worked in. And down below, I've noted some of the Beatles-related artists that Eric has done work with, and of course we have the Beatles. And by the way, I have speculated that I think it's possible that it's Eric Clapton playing lead on Old Brown Shoe. He's done work for, quote, Paul McCartney, or Billy, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Vivian Stanshall, Yoko Ono, Billy Preston, the Rolling Stones, etc. And if we step back to the Glenn Campbell clip where Glenn introduces Cream and states that they have played on Beatle recordings, the Rolling Stones, Donovan, and so on, then, I think it's fair game to speculate and think about the possibility that Eric played on more than While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And that also goes for Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. Were they on Beatle tracks as well? Okay, so I'll leave that there. Let's now move to slide number 10, and let's take a listen to an early Led Zeppelin interview. And they're talking about the death of the personality cult. Let's take a listen. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a 3-minute tutorial on how social engineering is done and how new genres of music are created. So this is a clip. It goes back to circa 1969. It's John Bonham and Robert Plant. The Beatles are at end of life as a band, and now the controllers are steering the focus, the young people's minds, toward Led Zeppelin. So, as I mentioned, this is an example of social engineering in the process of creating a new genre of music. And of course, the media plays a major role in shaping thoughts. And it's done subliminally, steering people from point A to point B. So what I'll do is I will read my notes, and then after I do that, I will play the clip in its entirety, and you can take a listen for yourself. Okay? So the clip starts by telling us that a Melody Maker poll by its readers have voted Led Zeppelin the top world group, and they have replaced the Beatles, and the Beatles are out. In fact, that's the exact wording that they use. The Beatles are out. And then the narrator tells us that the songs that the Beatles wrote were evergreens, meaning they were popular, hummable like White Christmas and Autumn Leaves. But there's a new generation where Bing Crosby and the Ink Spots meant nothing. And so what they do here is very interesting. They go from Bing Crosby and the Ink Spots, and they bypass the Beatles, and they go right to Led Zeppelin. So what they're doing here is associating the Beatles with older music, an older genre. It's not cool to be there anymore. Where you want to be is right here with Led Zeppelin. In other words, the Beatles are yesterday's news. No pun intended. Then we're told that a new generation is demanding a new kind of music. They're not asking for it. They're not requesting it. They are demanding it. And that new music, of course, is Led Zeppelin. And then they talk about the death of the personality cult. And they associate the Beatles as a personality cult. And then we're told people are now interested in young musicians and not an image. So what they're telling us is the Beatles weren't really musicians. They were an image. And then the clip ends with John Bottom saying that people are coming to listen to what you are playing and not just to look at you. It's about being a musician. And then the clip ends by reinforcing the point that the Beatles, as a personality cult, are dead. And so with that, let's take a listen.
It's cool, it's groovy, it's number one, the Led Zeppelin. The Led Zeppelin, but I'm afraid that you and other dads like you, Bob, may never have heard of them. But this British group has made musical history today. Readers of the Melody Maker have voted them the top world group. The significance is that the Beatles have held this title for 8 years, but now the Beatles are out. 8 years ago, the Beatles were 4 clean-cut and clean-shaven young men who had a happy knack for songwriting. The tunes they wrote and sang were evergreens, as hummable and as immortal as I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas and Autumn Leaves. But a new generation was growing up, a generation to whom Bing Crosby and the Ink Spots meant nothing, a generation that demanded a new kind of music, music like the music of the Led Zeppelin.
I think that the last year has seen a bit of a revolution in popular music and the death of the personality cult. Led Zeppelin have taken over where the Beatles left off because people are now interested in young musicians rather than in, say, what Paul McCartney had for breakfast. People have turned inwards and they're looking to the young musicians scene. Led Zeppelin are good musicians and people are voting for them rather than for an image as they used to years ago.
The Beatles ran for 8 years, and when one thinks of a song of theirs, Yesterday, which had all sorts of variations played upon it, do you think as musicians you'll be able to last as long as 8 years? Do you think you'll be inventive enough? You know, the old thing about being able to whistle a tune, being able to hum the tune as you go away, I don't think I could hum any of your stuff.
No, but I think it's changing. That's the main thing, you see. I think that's why the awards have changed, because the kids are changing for a start. And so is the music changing. And I think, well, there's already a single out of Whole Lot of Love, an orchestra playing it, which is quite interesting, really. The flute plays what the lead vocal would do.
So you're saying that your fans don't necessarily want to whistle the tunes, to hum the tune. But they're much more sophisticated than, my generation.
I think so. Not in that sense. I think these days that let's say the public, it's not just say the kids, because we've had sort of all sorts of people at concerts, I think that they're coming to listen to what you're playing and not just to look at you and see what you are. I mean, I remember when let's go back a few years, when I first went to see the Beatles, because we've mentioned them a few times, it was to look at them, It wasn't, you didn't really bother what you were listening to.
Yes.
And today, it's not what you are, it's what you're playing. And
well, this is interesting. We've heard that the personality cult is dead, but...
There you go. So that's 3 minutes of social engineering, and you can see how they do this. It's very slick. Okay, so at the very beginning of this presentation, I had mentioned that I was going to cover some additional occultism around the Beatles, and I'm going to show you some occult stuff that is hidden in plain sight. Okay, so before I get started, a big shout out to Jimmy House 7883. It was Jimmy's comment on a post that I put up on my community tab on my Paul is Dead channel that led me to take a closer look at this particular symbol right here at the top of the Parlophone label. And in Jimmy's comment, he said, boy, that sure looks like the Leviathan cross. And so that made me go do some research. And indeed, it is the Leviathan cross. Here it is here. And here it is on the label. Now, the difference is the label is a little more ornate, but it is clearly the same symbol. We have the double cross at the top, and we have the infinity symbol at the bottom. And before I get more into the Leviathan cross, which is also referred to as the Satanic cross, I just want to call out that EMI has numerology of 9. So that's the same number associated with Paul McCartney. And the number 9 is associated with change, transformation, endings, and it leads to the number 10, new beginnings. So what Parlophone did was to put this symbol on their label and then put a circle around it. And by doing this, what they've done is they've created a sigil. And a sigil is an inscribed or painted symbol considered to have magical power. And if we go down to the label to the left here, this is referred to as the Parlophone black and yellow label. And this came after the black and gold. So the big label is referred to as the black and gold label. And if you think about the colors black and gold, we can think in terms of alchemy, because those are colors that are associated with alchemy. So it gets even more interesting. And we could see on the yellow and black label that the Leviathan cross is at the top of the label, and it's within a circle, a yellow circle. So again, it's a sigil. And then if we move to the label on the right, this is a label that EMI used for later pressings of their records, including the Beatles and other artists. And we can see the Leviathan cross is still there, and underneath it, Parlophone. And the Leviathan cross and Parlophone are enclosed in a rectangle. So anytime you enclose a symbol in a circle or a rectangle or a square, we're talking about sigils. And with this label, and again, this is a label that was used for later pressings, we can see that they not only enclosed the Leviathan cross and Parlophone, but they did it for EMI, and they did it twice. And in fact, this label is referred to as the EMI 2-box label. Okay, so this is occultism in plain sight. So let me take you through some information I found on the Leviathan cross, and of course I'll put the link down below so you can read the article in its entirety. The Leviathan or Satanic cross, also called the Infinity cross, is comprised of a double cross at the top and an infinity symbol at the bottom. The double cross is also known as the Cross of Lorraine. So the double cross is up here at the top of the symbol, and then we can see the infinity symbol at the bottom. In the context of its use, as a representative of the Church of Satan. It symbolizes protection and the balance between humans. The infinity symbol at the bottom represents the entire universe. To put two and two together, the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, uses the Leviathan symbol to mock the Christian belief and depict that humans are their own center of balance and do not need God or any other mythical creature to ensure balance in the universe. In a way, the Leviathan symbol states that the existence of humans alone is the ultimate truth, which is the fundamental belief of the Church of Satan. And it is also a main tenet of Thelema and Luciferianism, where one pursues their pure will in their pursuit of becoming a god. Okay, so again, occultism in plain sight. And so when I talk about the Beatles as an entity being immersed in the occult, this is the type of thing that I'm referring to. Okay, so again, Jimmy Howe, 7883, thank you very much for the heads up. Alrighty, so with that, let's move to slide number 12 and take a look at the Beatles Help album. Okay, so before I get to the Help album, I thought to myself after I finished up the last segment, it's possible that some of the audience might ask the question, is the symbol, the Leviathan cross that's on the Parlophone label, is that the symbol for the British pound? Could it be? And the answer, at least from my perspective, is no, absolutely not. They are two different symbols. So again, on the left, we have the Leviathan cross, and to the right is the symbol for the British pound. Now, if you do a search on the Leviathan cross, you will find versions of it with a snake making its way up through the middle column, as I show here. And that could explain the ornateness of the Parlophone version of the Leviathan cross, because it does look rather snake-like when we look at it. Okay, so I just wanted to call that out. Now, let's take a look at the Beatles Help album. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Beatles Help album, specifically the front cover, and I'm going to show you that it is occultism hidden in plain sight. When I was a younger lad and I would look at the front cover of the album, I wondered what the Beatles were doing with their arms. I remember back in the day reading that they were spelling out the word help in semaphore. A semaphore is a method of visual signaling, usually by means of flags or lights, and in this case the Beatles are just using their arms. So if the Beatles were actually spelling out help in semaphore, then George's positioning would be the letter H. John would be E, Paul would be L, and Ringo would be P. Except when you go to a semaphore chart, and they have that on Wikipedia, George's positioning is the letter N. John's is U, Paul's is J, and Ringo's is V. So you can see it's not even close to spelling the word help. In Wikipedia, it tells us that on the UK Parlophone release, which is what we're looking at here, the letters formed by the Beatles appear to be N-U-J-V, which is what I deducted. The slightly rearranged US release on Capitol Records appeared to indicate the letters N-V-U-J. So in either case, they're not spelling out help in semaphore. So the question becomes, if they're not spelling out help in semaphore, what are they doing? And what they're doing is displaying Thelema ritual signs. So if we move to the right-hand side of the chart, we can see the first position, which would be George, is the ritual sign known as Osiris slain. In the second position, which would be John, that's the ritual sign known as Typhon. And Typhon was also identified with Set, who was the Egyptian god of destruction and darkness. In the third position, which would be Paul, that sign is known as Isis Morning. And the last position, Ringo, that ritual sign is referred to as Set Fighting. And all of these ritual signs can be found on the Thelema website. And here's the link here, and I will also drop it down in the description box. So a logical question to ask would be, why are they doing this? And I think to understand it, we need to go back to the Egyptian story of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. So to explain that story at a very high level, Osiris ruled over 2 kingdoms, and during that period of time, there was peace and prosperity. It was essentially a golden age. His wife was Isis, and Set was his younger brother. And Set was envious of Osiris because Set wanted to rule over the 2 kingdoms. So he battles his brother, and he kills Osiris. And not only does he kill him, but he dismembers him and then disperses his body parts throughout the kingdoms. Isis, because her husband has died, goes into mourning, and then she scours the 2 kingdoms to put Osiris back together, which she's able to do. And we're told she's able to do this because she is a great magician, and we'll touch on this a little later in the presentation. After she puts Osiris back together, she then conceives Horus. And when Horus comes of age, he battles Set. And it is the classic battle between the light and the dark. Horus represents the light, or the savior, and Set represents darkness. In fact, the etymology of the word sunset is derived from Set. Okay, so that's a very high level telling of the mythology behind Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. So why do I think it's important to understand that story? It's because I think that the album cover of Help is telling that story. So if we look at the sequencing of the ritual signs, and I don't believe it's coincidence, they are in a specific order. We have Osiris slain. Well, who killed Osiris? It was Set or Typhon. When that happens, Isis goes into mourning. And then when Isis puts Osiris back together again and she conceives Horus, then the battle between Horus and Set takes place. And that would be represented by Set fighting. And then I had a thought about the title of the album, Help with an exclamation point. So Help is a calling out, a mayday for assistance, for help. And who would they be calling out to? To defeat Set, it would be Horus. So I think it's possible that the Help album cover is foretelling the transition from the Eon of Osiris, or the Age of Pisces, to the Eon of Horus, or the Age of Aquarius. Now, there was one part of the story that perplexed me a little bit. Crowley defines the Eon of Osiris, which is roughly equivalent to the Age of Pisces, as a period of oppression where humanity is shackled. Yet, in Egyptian mythology, the reign of Osiris was peace and prosperity. There's a mismatch. It's disconnected. And then I thought through it some more. When we factor in Set, the reign of Osiris was cut short because Set, the god of destruction and darkness, defeats Osiris. So I think it's possible that when Crowley defined his Eon of Osiris, which is roughly equivalent to the Age of Pisces, he was factoring in the entirety of the story of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus, where the reign of Osiris began peaceful and with prosperity, but then fell into darkness because Set defeated him. And it's not until Horus comes of age that he's going to battle Set. And as I mentioned before, that's the classic struggle between the light and the dark. Now, I also want to be clear that when I'm discussing this content and presenting it, it does not mean that I am advocating it. It does not mean that I agree with it. In fact, I'm not in agreement with it at all. For those of you who follow my work, you know that my position is that the controllers, who are occultists, everything that they do is inorganic and not natural. They do not follow the natural order. Everything they do is engineered, it's orchestrated, it's manipulated through their occultism, which would include magic, rituals, ceremony, alchemy, and so on. And if you think about where we are today, we are living through what? The Great Reset, or the return of Set, the return of the god of destruction, chaos, and darkness. And in the minds of the cultic elite, the only way out is for Horus, the savior god, the god of light, to return and battle Set. I know that for a lot of people, this sounds like crazy stuff, but once you understand that the world is controlled by occultists, then it starts to make a lot more sense. Now, before we move on, I'm sure there are those in the audience who are wondering if the Beatles knew that they were displaying ritual signs. And I believe they did not know. They were instructed to show up for the photo shoot. They were told how to position their arms. The photos were taken, and then the lads went on their merry way. So I don't think they had any idea what was going on. Okay, so with that, let's move to the next segment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about George Harrison's last album, Brainwashed, and I'm going to show you some additional occultism hidden in plain sight. Alrighty, so this is a slide that I presented going back a few months ago in another presentation, and I called out some of the hidden clues on George Harrison's last album titled Brainwashed. And I'll review the clues very quickly here, and then we will move to a new clue that was brought to my attention by Vicky, who does our Pepper Time presentations, and she asked a question about how the title of the album, Brainwashed, was put together with regard to uppercase and lowercase lettering. But we'll get there in a moment. Now, in my previous presentation, I pointed out that George decided to use 5 crash dummies to represent the 5 Beatles, John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Billy. And I also commented that the use of crash dummies was interesting in itself, because crash dummies, when you think about it, they don't have a mind of their own, and essentially they are props. So if I had to guess, George was telling us that the Beatles were a manufactured entity, and there was a machine behind them. Now, if we look to the left of the album cover, we can see that the 5 crash dummies leave a shadow. But the shadow only has 4 heads. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that represents the 4 Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, because you're not supposed to know about Billy. Paul has always been Paul. And what George is telling us is that you are shown an illusion. You're seeing 4, but there's really 5. So what George is explaining to us here is what you see may not be reality. And again, he's doing this by showing us that there were 5 Beatles, but you're told there were only 4. And then in the center of the 5 crash dummies, we have a television set. And that is representing brainwashing and mind control. And then we have the pentagrams being displayed, with one prominently on the television screen. And so if we read the definition of a pentagram, and this comes to us from a typical online dictionary, a pentagram is a 5-pointed star that is formed by drawing a continuous line in 5 straight segments, often used as a mystic and magical symbol. So even your typical online dictionary tells us that a pentagram is often used as a mystical and magical symbol. Now, the next definition I pulled from the Thelema website. The greater ritual of the pentagram is a fundamental ritual of ceremonial and thelemic magic. It was originally taught by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn as a banishing ritual. So that's what I presented in my previous presentation, these clues and these symbols. But there is one that I missed, and as I mentioned when I first started this segment, it was brought to my attention by Vicky. So let's take a look at that now, and I think you're going to find it interesting. Okay, so before I get to the next slide, I wanted to set it up with this chart. Going back several months ago, I posted this post from Ringo on my YouTube community tab on my Paul is Dead channel. And in that post, Ringo says, "The drumming on Rain stands out for me because I feel that was someone else playing. I was possessed." And I remember somebody leaving a very funny comment. And they said, "Yeah, you were possessed, all right, by Bernard Purdie." And that was a reference back to Bernard saying that in the early days, between 1962 and 1966, there were 4 drummers on the Beatles recorded tracks, and Ringo was not one of them. But what if Ringo's post has a darker meaning? If we take a look at George's album Brainwashed, we can see that the letters in the title are all in uppercase except A, I, and N. And so he's highlighting the word rain. And why would he do that? Well, let's take a look at a possibility. Okay, so let's take a look at George Harrison's Brainwashed album and try to get some context around why George encoded the word rain into the title of the album, and is that linked back to the post that I showed you where Ringo said that when he, quote, played on the song Rain, he was possessed. And if we look at one of the lyrics from the Beatles song Rain, if the rain comes, they run and hide their heads, they might as well be dead. Now, if you want more information on this topic, I highly recommend you read Daniel Esterlin's book, The Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses. It's a great book in general, but in chapter 3, titled The Killing of the King, he goes into greater detail on Rain Man and Rain. And he has examples from various artists. Most of them are rap artists, but there are also examples from Bob Dylan as an example where the songs talk about Rain Man or rain. So why did George encode the word rain in the title of his album Brainwashed? Was it just artistic flair? I don't think so. Because as I mentioned in the previous slide, all of the letters in the title of the album are in uppercase, except A, I, and N. And when George did that, he highlighted the word rain. So what does that mean? So using Daniel's book as a source, also a website that I found, and the link is right here, and it will also be in the description box below. You can read it for yourself. We get this information. The Rain Man, or Rain, is a demonic entity reported to be the corrupting influence behind the music industry who makes deals with those who aspire to make it big in the industry. The word umbrella is also synonymous with the Rain Man. The word umbrella is derived from a Latin word meaning shadow or under the influence of umbra. It can also be used in reference to a paranormal entity such as a ghost. And of course we have the shadows on George's album. And on the Beatles 65 album, all 4 Beatles are holding umbrellas. And if you do a search for Beatles and umbrella, you're going to find a number of images where the Beatles are holding umbrellas. Many believe Rain Man is connected to Baphomet, a demonic entity from occult folklore, though it is also likely that the Rain Man is a different being entirely while representing a higher power. I don't see this as any different than going to the crossroads, making a deal with the devil, entering into a Faustian bargain, or what Bob Dylan called making a deal with the chief commander. And is that what George is telling us? That the Beatles entered into a Faustian bargain? In Memoirs, it tells us that John and Paul entered into a pact in October of 1963. In the book Lennon Prophecy by Joseph Niezgoda, Joseph theorizes that John Lennon may have entered into a pact in December of 1960, and that pact ran for 20 years. So if we do the math, 20 years from December 1960 takes us to December of 1980, and of course John was assassinated in December of 1980. Also, there was an attempt on George Harrison's life going back to December 30th, 1999. He was almost stabbed to death by a 33-year-old man, 33, at 3:30 a.m. in the morning, 33, and George at the time was 56 years old. 5 plus 6 equals 11. And there's also occulted numerology embedded in the date. December, 1 plus 2 is 3. On the 30th date, 3 plus 0 is 3, 33. In 1999, 999. And if we flip the 9s, we have 666. So I think George, by embedding and encoding the word rain within the title of his last album, Brainwashed, was telling us that the Beatles made the pact. They signed on the dotted line. They came to an agreement with the chief commander. And when I go to the next slide, I'm going to walk you through some additional occult symbolism that I think goes hand in hand with what I'm showing you here. Now, before I go to the next chart, I also want to be clear that I am not insinuating that every song that contains the word rain, either in the title or the lyrics, means that that artist or that band has made a deal with the devil. My wife and I co-wrote a song titled Rainy Day, and we did not enter into a Faustian bargain. So we have to be smart about this as well. But when we see situations like what George has done here, where he has clearly embedded the word rain into the title of his album, then that's worth inspection. Now, if an artist has the words Rain Man in the lyrics or in the title, then that's probably relevant. And we also have to look at it within the context of the level of occult symbolism around that band or that group. And also, how prominent are they in the music industry or in the entertainment industry? Okay, so I just wanted to make that point. And so with that, let's move to the next slide and let's talk about Ringo and his peace signs. Okay, slide number 17. And I realize it is a busy chart, but I will walk you through it step by step. So let's start on the left-hand side and let's get some mainstream definitions of the peace sign. The symbol was designed by Gerald Holtham for the British nuclear disarmament movement. The symbol is a superimposition of the flag semaphore for the characters N and D, taken to stand for nuclear disarmament. In 1968, the anti-communist evangelist Billy James Hargis described the symbol as a broken cross, which he claimed represented the Antichrist. Hargis's interpretation was taken up by a member of the John Birch Society, Marjorie Jensen, who wrote a pamphlet claiming the symbol was equivalent to a symbol of the devil. So that's the origins of the peace symbol representing the broken cross. That's where it came from. But I'm going to focus on the two-finger symbolism. So what is the possible occult meaning of the peace sign? Is the two-finger peace sign a symbolic reference to Vav, the Hebrew consonant for V, which is the sixth letter of the modern Hebrew language? In modern Hebrew, the word Vav, which in ancient Hebrew was Wa, is used to mean hook or a nail. Vav in gematria represents the number 6. Nail symbolism can mean securing, protecting, fastening, as well as suffering and sacrifice. And if we look to the left, I have an image showing what the Hebrew letter Vav looks like. And again, it is the 6th letter, and it is associated with a hook or a nail. The nail is often associated in the Christian tradition with the crucifixion of Christ and thus symbolizes his passion. Christ was nailed to the cross. Relics that are claimed to be the holy nails with which Jesus was crucified are objects of veneration among some Christians, particularly Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. In 2 Enoch, the Slavonic interpretation, the leader of the watches, otherwise known as the Grigori or fallen angels, is Satan nail. So the first question, is the V peace sign mocking Christianity? In memoirs it states, Crowley introduced the symbol to Winston Churchill, V for victory. Or does it really mean conquest of the Aeon of Osiris and securing the Aeon of Horus? V is also a representation of the master number 11. The double V is the master number 22, which is a powerful number known for its transformative power, turning desires and dreams into reality. V is also the 22nd letter in the English alphabet, and 22 is associated with the master architect and the master builder, representing manifestations and creations. And then I ask my second question. Does the double V represent the sigil of Satan? So if we go to the middle of the chart, at the top we have Ringo making the double V sign number 1, and V sign number 2. Below him is the sigil of Satan, and you can see I have it numbered. So number 1 is the first V at the bottom of the sigil. Number 2 is the second V, and we can see it's an upside down triangle. And then within the second V, we have another V. And also note the hooks or crooks at the bottom of the sigil. And I'll talk about the crook in a little bit, especially as it pertains to Billy. So the satanic sigil contains 3 V's. And here, Vav in Gematria represents the number 6. So we have 666. But if we focus on the 2 primary V's, then that is representative of the occult number 66. And here I have an image of Billy making 2 V's with his hands. And not only does he do that, but he took the time to trim his facial hair so that there's a V on both sides of his face. Okay, so all of this, folks, this is not coincidence. Now, let's move over to the image on the right, where we have George hammering nails into John's head. And we can see how George has the nails positioned. He's holding the nails in the shape of 2 V's. Here's V number 1 and V number 2. So what is being displayed here is the sigil of Satan. And the Google Play icon, which I rotated to show you that it is also the sigil of Satan. Here's the first V at the bottom of the sigil, and here is the second V, the larger V, the upside down triangle. Now, going back to my 2 questions, is the V peace sign mocking Christianity? I believe the answer to that is yes. And does the double V represent the sigil of Satan? And I think the answer to that is yes as well. So here we have another example, and I think this is a pretty big example of the Beatles as an entity being immersed in occultism. To me, this is very, very obvious as to what's going on here. Okay? And with that, let's move to slide 18 and talk a little bit more about Egypt and how that ties into the Beatles and Billy in particular. Okay, so this is a slide that I presented before, and I put it together in order to give an overview of how the controllers, the cultic elite, plan on moving the world from the Piscean Age, or the Aeon of Osiris, to the Aquarian Age, or the Aeon of Horus. And again, as they have defined that new age or that new Aeon. I have explained on many occasions that the world is controlled by occultists, and that occultism has a foundation in the Egyptian mysteries and in Babylon as well. And so on the left-hand side of the chart, that's Horus, and he represents the crucified, sacrificed, resurrected Messiah, Savior, and Liberator. And it's based in paganism. And if we move to the center of the slide with the image of Jesus, that's the Piscean Age, or the Eon of Osiris, and the predominant religious structure was Christianity or monotheism. So in the Piscean Age, Jesus has the role as the crucified, sacrificed, resurrected Messiah, Savior, and Liberator. Now to move from the Eon of Osiris to the Eon of Horus, a couple of things have to happen. There has to be a breaking down, a dismantling of the existing structure. So the existing structure would be the Eon of Osiris or the Piscean Age. And in alchemy, in order to bring in the new, you can't have any remnants of the old. And the Beatles play a very, very significant role in that dismantling process. In fact, I refer to the Beatles as the Pied Pipers of the Eon of Horus, and we'll get into the Pied Piper and Pan in just a moment. The basic concepts at a high level of what the cultic elite, the controllers, believe philosophically and spiritually goes back to Aleister Crowley. That man is a god. And I have concluded that the majority of those in the Pyramid of Power subscribe to Crowley's religion of Thelema, which is Luciferianism, which is based in paganism. So in order to make the transition from the Eon of Osiris or the Piscean Age to the Eon of Horus or the Age of Aquarius, some things have to happen in order to break down the old structures. So morals, ethics, and basic beliefs, traditional beliefs, needed to be reshaped. Non-traditional values would be introduced, thus breaking away from traditional values. There would be a breaking away from institutionalized religion, and in particular Christianity, because Christianity is the dominant spiritual religious belief system of the Piscean Age. And if they're going to move to the Aquarian Age or the Eon of Horus, then Christianity has to go away. And this is all done through social engineering, which includes free love, drugs, and so on. And in order to facilitate this dismantling, based upon the philosophy and the ideology of the cultic elite, which goes back to the Egyptian mysteries, there's a particular player that needs to be introduced into the process. That player is Set. I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Great Reset means the return of Set. And if we look at the splash screen from Peter Jackson's documentary Get Back, look at the G. It's an S. Set back, or Set is back. And the Beatles, as the Pied Pipers of the Eon of Horus, are setting the table for the return of Horus to battle Set. Set is the god of destruction, chaos, and darkness. And once Horus prevails, then peace and prosperity will return. And that will be the Aquarian Age or the Eon of Horus. And again, what I'm explaining is based upon my understanding of the controller's spiritual ideology, which goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And in Memoirs, it explains that Paul and Billy are reenacting the Osiris-Horus ritual, which needs to happen in order for Horus to return. And not only that, but the book tells us that the cultic elite are positioning Paul McCartney as a Messiah Savior figure. In other words, he becomes Horus. And if we go to John's song, I Found Out, he has a lyric in there that says, I've seen religions from Jesus to Paul. And I know this sounds like crazy stuff, But once you understand that we're controlled by occultists, then perhaps this makes more sense. So what I'm going to do now is to read the footnote in Memoirs on page 557, which explains where they're going with this. Okay, so bear with me 1 second. Okay, so I had to put my readers on. If the plan continues to be as successful as it has thus far, centuries from now, when people reverently discuss Vishnu's avatars who transform the world, they will primarily speak of Krishna, Jesus, and Paul. So we can put Vishnu and Krishna in the same category as Horus, a Messiah, Savior, Liberator God. Consider how little was written about Jesus in the early centuries of his Christian era, and by contrast, how much more Paul was already promoted before his age of Aquarius began. The work to establish him as a Christ figure is unparalleled. Based on the current rate of progress, those working to deify their Messiah in the collective consciousness expect to reach critical mass much faster than it took Jesus' followers. Over time, Paul's media-driven veneration will include mystical faith-promoting stories. Convincing the world that Paul is the true avatar of this Eon of Horus will confirm the validity of Crowley's prophecies. Vindicating Crowley as a true prophet empowers those holding the reins of Paulism, just as Christianity empowered the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. Paulism is one branch of a larger tree that will create the illusion of choice, each being free to choose his or own branch, but with every option controlled by the same people who also control politics and wealth in the New World Order. Upon William's death, the illuminated will eulogize Paul as the god of music. The profane will hear the epithet, but understand it metaphorically as with Elvis, the king of rock, or Michael, the king of pop. After the massive depopulation, a generation of literalists will emerge. They will turn against their unbelieving parents to proclaim Paul's divinity. Paul will be recognized as the Messiah, with Aleister Crowley as his prophet. Dissenters will call Paul an antichrist, not in the same sense of opposing Jesus, but for replacing him. Crowley opposers will say, is a false prophet. Most devotees will say that Paul, who is Krishna, or Horus, was born a god, an incarnation of Vishnu, and that he lived to a ripe old age. Others will say he was born mortal, but obtained a fullness of divinity by degrees as he grew in light and knowledge. The illuminated will secretly pass on the great mystery that Paul embodied gods that continued in William, reenacting Osiris and Horus. Such William mythology will offend those who feel it diminishes Paul's independent divinity. However, the same stories will inspire the elect. So there you go. And with that, let's move to slide number 19 and talk a little bit about ISIS. Okay, so a big shout out to Wendy Stone, who is a fellow researcher and colleague. Wendy has participated in a couple of the Memoirs roundtables, and she sent me the image that you see on the right and said, Mike, I think you might find this interesting. And indeed, it is very interesting. So let's jump right in. Does son of the magician mean Aleister Crowley is Billy's biological father? Perhaps not. The Egyptian goddess Isis is known as the big magician or great magician, whose power transcended that of all other gods. Based on Egyptian lore, if Billy, in his mind, is an incarnation of Horus, then Isis is his mother, and that is how he became the son of the magician. In Memoirs, we're told that Billy, aka Paul McCartney, was mentored by Aleister Crowley for 10 years, and that 10-year period of time started in 1937 when Billy was born, through 1947 when Aleister Crowley passed away. In the book, Billy refers to Crowley as Father Crowley, but if the connection back to Isis is the reason why he is referred to as the son of the magician, then the reference to Father Crowley is connected back to Crowley's religion of Thelema and is not parental. Now, could Billy still be bloodlined to Crowley? I believe that that is very possible because within the Pyramid of Power, it's all about bloodlines. So Wendy's discovery certainly drops a monkey wrench into the premise that Billy's biological father was Aleister Crowley. I thought it was possible based upon Crowley's propensity for sex magic. And I was thinking maybe that was the way that Billy was conceived. But I was also careful not to make any declarations. In other words, stating that Crowley was indeed Billy's biological father. And the reason why I did not make that leap was because I did not have enough evidence to link Billy directly back to Aleister Crowley. Now, that being said, it does not mean that Crowley was not extremely influential in Billy's life. I think the evidence for that is very clear. Now, coincidentally, there was another researcher that contacted me a few months ago, and they have been looking into Billy's family tree. They picked up on a clue in memoirs that took them down a different path, away from Crowley and in another direction. And they shared some of their research with me, and it supports the premise that Crowley is not Billy's biological father. The research also says that perhaps Billy is not a Wallace, he's not a Shepherd, or a Campbell. And so I asked this researcher if they would be open to presenting their findings, and they agreed. And so we're scheduled to connect in September to put a show together. And I think you'll find it very, very interesting. Okay, so stay tuned. And so with that, let's move to slide number 20, and let's talk about the Shepherd's Crook and Osiris. Okay, so Osiris and the Shepherd's Crook, and I asked the question, is Set the flail and Horus the crook? And I'll get to that in a moment. If we look to the image on the right, we have the McCartney character, and I'm referring to him as a character because that doesn't look like Billy to me. It's certainly not biological Paul, so my bet is that is a double. For starters, his hair is parted on the wrong side of his head, and the nose is different. But be that as it may, if we go along his left arm, we could see the shepherd's crook, or hook. And if you do a search, you'll find a number of pictures where the McCartney character is holding the shepherd's crook. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. To the right is an image of Osiris, and we can see Osiris in his right hand going diagonally across his chest to his right shoulder is holding the flail. And in his left hand, he has the shepherd's crook, which goes diagonally across his chest and up toward his left shoulder, and it forms an X. And with Egyptian symbolism, the X represents Osiris risen. And here's an image from the Thelema website for the Osiris risen ritual sign, which refers to resurrection, and we can see the arms are crossed. And if you do a search on the internet for celebrities and entertainers, and you type in Osiris risen, you're going to see a ton of images. Up above is the new logo for Twitter. So we can see that Twitter is also using the Osiris risen symbolism. So when I said earlier that Egyptian symbolism is ubiquitous, it is. It's everywhere. Once you know what to look for, you're going to see it everywhere. Now, if we go back to the Egyptian story between Osiris and Horus, we're told that Horus shares the same essence or soul as Osiris. And we are told the same thing in memoirs with regard to Billy's relationship with biological Paul McCartney. In the book, Tom tells us that Paul and Billy are reenacting the Osiris-Horus ritual, and Paul has the role of Osiris and Billy has the role of Horus. And in the book, Billy tells us that he has this spiritual, supernatural connection to Paul, where he can sense Paul within him. The point I'm making is the relationship between Billy and Paul is very similar to the relationship between Horus and Osiris. And I guess we could say, well, maybe that's because they're following a script, right? And that could very well be, but I would argue that that script is the reenactment of the ritual. So let's take a moment now and learn about the shepherd's crook and the flail. And we're also going to see how Billy's aliases, whether it be Shears or Shepherd, play into the crook. So let me take a moment and read what I have here on the left-hand side of the chart. The source is this link here, which will be in the description box if you wish to take a look for yourself. Becoming an Osiris. The crook and the flail are related to the great work of spiritual transformation, meaning mastery of the lower animal self. And when we talk about the great work in alchemy, it's known as the magnum opus. The crook and flail staffs were tools every Egyptian seeker used to transform his or her lower animal self into a servant of his or her higher spiritual self. And I noted the lower animal self with the number 6. 6 represents man or woman in the physical or material world. And 7 represents spiritual transformation or enlightenment. The crook was used by shepherds. The hook of the crook served to hold a runaway sheep. The crook symbolized the concept of rule, and it serves as the hieroglyph for the Egyptian word rule or ruler. However, rather than ruling over others, the crook seems to have also conveyed the idea of ruling one's lower self by gently guiding one's own behavior upward. So again, the number 6, the physical world or the physical plane, upward would be the number 7 to the spiritual realm of enlightenment. The flail was a simple agricultural tool used for threshing or beating grain, and it was also a weapon. Yet here, it's a weapon one might use on their own lower nature to aggressively whip one's lower self into line. This is how one becomes an Osiris. Occultists will quickly note that the two opposing and yet complementary concepts described here, mercy, meaning the crook, and severity, the flail, play a key role across various occult schools. Mercy is conveyed by the crook, as the crook is a merciful way to gently guide a straying animal back to the fold. Severity is conveyed by the flail, as the flail is a severe way to reprimand a rebellious animal and force that animal back into line. In this way, these two tools help to mercifully and severely guide the lower animal that is you, your lower animal self. So after I read this, I thought to myself, okay, so Billy in this Horus-Osiris role, because remember, Horus possesses the essence of Osiris, sees himself as the good shepherd. He has his shepherd's crook, and he's going to be merciful, and he's going to lead the flock or the herd to the promised land, to enlightenment. Now, for those that don't buy into the program, for those that don't buy into the Eon of Horus and the controller's version of the Age of Aquarius, then they're going to have to be flailed, right? So that, in my mind, represents Set. So through the chaos and through the dysfunction, that's how people who are not going along with the program are going to be forced to march in a certain direction. So if we think about what has taken place over the last 3 years, if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, then there were consequences. And some might be asking, hey Mike, do you have any idea who's playing the role of Set? I don't know, perhaps it's Klaus Schwab. But what I do see happening is this occult concept of the crook and the flail playing out. Okay, so with that, let's move to slide number 21, and let's talk about Pan. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about Pan, and before I get started, I want to thank Sally for the Billy Pan connection. And we have words in our language that goes back to the mythological gods, such as panic, pandemonium, pandemic. So Pan has an underpinning within our culture. So to get started, let's take a look at the right-hand side of the slide, and we have Pan leaping over a fence. It's the top right picture, and then below that we have Billy in the same exact pose, and he's leaping over a car. Is this coincidence? I don't think so. So Billy's making a connection back to Pan. Also, we have the word rain appearing again, this time as part of the title of Billy's album, Driving Rain. And then we have an image of Crowley, and this comes from the cover of a book titled Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan. I ordered the book. I haven't read it yet, but I am very interested to dig in to get some more information with regard to the connections between Crowley and the Cult of Pan. And then below that, we have the lads in their Sgt. Pepper outfits, and I will talk about that in a moment. Okay, so with that, let's get some background on Pan. In ancient Greek religion and mythology, Pan is the god of the wild, shepherds and flocks, rustic music and impromptus, and companion of the nymphs. He has the hindquarters, legs, and horns of a goat. He is also recognized as the god of fields, groves, wooded glens, and often affiliated with sex. Because of this, Pan is connected to fertility and the season of spring. So just within the first paragraph, we have the word shepherd popping up again, shepherds and flocks. And then when I read that he is the god of fields, groves, and wooded glens, that reminded me of Billy's song, Mother Nature's Son. The word pandemonium today refers to a place of chaos and confusion. John Milton, in his 1667 epic poem Paradise Lost, coined the word pandemonium. Milton's use of the word did not mean a place of utter chaos, but ironically, a peaceful council for fallen angels where they would plan their vengeance on God. In other words, pandemonium literally means chaos on earth, but order in hell. Pan is also similar to the Greek god Dionysus and his satyr companions, who were usually depicted drunk or in a state of sexual arousal. For Dionysus, spirituality came in the form of intoxication through wine, causing a form of ecstasy, stepping outside oneself to join nature as a whole. Pan, on the other hand, was void of any spiritual essence and advocated stepping inside oneself and into the unconscious dream world. Pan forced people to cross over into the unconscious world, a world distorted by repressed sexual desire and primitive fear. When I read this sounded very Crowley-like to me. And what I mean by that is Crowley essentially believed that humans, especially when we talk about the Eon of Osiris, were living in an unconscious state. They were not enlightened. They were not illuminated. They were oppressed and shackled. So with that comes repressed sexual desire, primitive fears, and so on. And of course, he believes that by transitioning from the Eon of Osiris to the Eon of Horus, that repression goes away and humans will become enlightened because they will be pursuing their pure or true will. Okay? Another interesting note, I found this in Wikipedia. Pan had a battle with Typhon, and as I mentioned earlier, Typhon is set, so there is a Pan-Horus connection. What that is specifically, I haven't figured it out. Maybe when I read the book, Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan, I'll have some more information. Also, I wanted to mention that Jack Parsons of Jet Propulsion Laboratory fame, or JPL, who was also a Crowley disciple and occultist, recited the Hymn of Pan before any rocket launch. And Jack Parsons was a very strange duck. Okay? All right, let's talk about the Pied Piper now. And the Pied Piper is a variation on the mythology of Pan. The town of Hamelin was plagued by an unusual number of rats, and a stranger from out of town, wearing multicolored or pied clothes, showed up and offered to get rid of the rats in exchange for payment. The stranger then produced a flute or pipe and began playing a tune. When he played, all the rats followed him out through the gates of the city and either to a nearby mountain or into the river, depending upon which version you encounter. When the townspeople saw how easily the piper had rid the town of rats, they regretted the amount they had offered to pay him and reneged on their deal. The piper vowed revenge, and according to one brother's grim account, he returned and once more walked through the town playing his pipe. This time, all the town's 130 children followed him out through the town's east gate and up to the nearby mountain, which in most accounts opened wide to swallow them up, and they disappeared, never to be seen again. And that's what happens when you don't pay the piper. So, going back to the Pied Piper wearing multicolored or pied clothes, let's take a look at the Sgt. Pepper outfits. Is it a reference back to the Pied Piper? I'll let you decide. Also, another variation of the Pan mythology is Peter Pan. And whenever I read the Peter Pan story, it takes me back to the Fool card of the tarot deck. So the point I'm making, at least in my mind, is all of this stuff is intertwined. It's very elaborate, the way it's all stitched together. Okay, so with that, let's move to the next slide, and I'm going to play that interview that Billy did last year, where he talks about driving a herd or a flock of sheep through the city of London. And that ties back to the Shepherd's Crook that I took everybody through, as well as Pan. So let's go there now and take a listen. Okay, so here's the interview from March of 2022. Let's take a listen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Woo! Ooh, ooh.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Mark.
For Paul McCartney.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Now, being a knight.
Yeah.
What does that enable you to do? Like, can you go to the British Museum and take out armor?
No, but I can drive a herd of sheep through the city of London.
That really?
Yeah.
That's a real thing.
Well, what it is, they give you the freedom. It's slightly different. They give you the freedom of the city.
Yeah.
And my daughter, Stella, said, what is it? Did you get anything? I said, I don't know. I got to think. I don't know. So she looked it up.
Yeah. And
she said, yeah, it is. I am entitled to drive a flock of sheep through the city of London.
I'm surprised Capitol didn't think of that for a publicity thing.
This time.
There you go, folks. You cannot make this stuff up. Okay, so with that, let's move to the next slide and let's talk about Billy's Juju Eyeball. Okay, so earlier in the presentation, I explained that Billy is blind in his right eye, and he has an ocular prosthetic, and he only has vision in his left eye. And before Sally made the discovery about Billy's right eye, I used to wonder about the lyric, "He got Juju Eyeball," in the Beatles song, "Come Together." What did it mean? So let's take a look at what juju means. Juju is an object that has been deliberately infused with magical power or the magical power itself. Juju operates on the principle of spiritual contagious contact based on physical contact. The underlying belief is that two entities that have been in close contact have similar properties even after being separated. It then becomes possible to manipulate one in order to reach the other. This is essentially what Billy is telling us in the memoirs of Billy Shears, where he explains that he has this otherworldly spiritual connection with biological Paul, and Paul's essence or his spirit resides within Billy, and they are essentially sharing the same physical body, that they are one. Part of Billy is Billy, and the other part of him is Paul. Thus, in that context, a person's hair, fingernails, a piece of clothing, a shoe, a sock, or a piece of jewelry worn by them are all perfect candidates for juju because they are believed to retain the spiritual aura of their owner. Again, in memoirs, Billy tells us that when he met the McCartney family after Paul's death, that he was given articles of Paul's clothing. And so when I read this, I started to connect some dots. Likewise, it is thought that spiritual similarity can be created by deliberately placing two things in physical contact. The underlying belief is that spiritual assimilation and fusion will take place, with one entity absorbing the qualities of the other. And this goes back to what I just said, where Billy believes that he shares the spiritual essence of biological Paul McCartney, making them one. So I'm going to say that the lyric, "He got Juju Eyeball and come together," was a clue. And it's a clue that covers two angles. The first being that Billy has an artificial eye. He's blind in his right eye. The second is another reference to the occultism that surrounds the Beatles as an entity. And so with that, let's move to the next slide and take a look at another clue about Billy's right eye. This time it comes up in a recent video upload by the YouTube channel I Am a Phony. Let's take a look. Okay, so this clue came to me from a listener, and I forgot to write their YouTube handle down, so I apologize, but please stake your claim down below in the comments section. And as I mentioned, it has to do with a recent upload by I Am a Phony, and it's a song that is sung by John Lennon, and it's called "I Know It's True." And the listener said, "Hey Mike, take a look at the 1 minute 38 second mark. Paul has a deformed eye." So I took a screen capture of the image at the 1 minute 38 second mark, and lo and behold, there is something going on with the eye. It looks deformed. We can see it's closed and it's encircled. And it's bringing attention to the eye. And what is the message? I believe the message is confirming that Billy is blind in that right eye. And I refer to this image as the McCartney character because it's clearly not biological Paul. It appears to me to be a hybrid between Paul and Billy. Take a look at the chin. "Man, you let your face grow long." The lyric from I Am the Walrus. Also, 1 minute 38 seconds, if we break that time down in numerology, we have a minute 38 equals 1 plus 3 plus 8, which equals 12, which equals 1 plus 2, which equals 3. And of course, we have Billy's recent album, McCartney 3. 3 represents the triple sevens. 3 times 7 is 21. 2 plus 1 equals 3. The triple sevens are associated with Aleister Crowley, which is associated with his lightning flash of creation. And if you want to learn more about the lightning flash of creation, I will have this link down in the description box below. Now let's shift up gears and take a look at how artificial intelligence is going to be used to keep the Beatles machine chugging along. Alrighty, this is an article that comes to us from Sky News. I posted the article to my YouTube community tab going back a number of months ago on my Paul is Dead channel, and the title of the chart, "Keeping the Myth Going with Technology. Expect more technology shenanigans in the future, such as deep fake." And if we go back to some other presentations that I did, I had predicted that this is exactly what was going to happen, that the pumping up of the Beatle myth was going to be enhanced with technology. But the problem we have today is it's very difficult to discern between what is real and what is not. So let me read an excerpt from the article. The link will be down in the description box below. Artificial intelligence has been used to create, quote, "the last Beatles record set to be released later this year," Sir Paul McCartney, or Billy, has revealed. The Beatles star, 80, who was really 86, said his late bandmate John Lennon's vocals from an old demo had been extricated and made, quote, "pure" thanks to technology. It came about during the making of the documentary series The Beatles Get Back, which was released in 2021 and directed by Lord of the Rings filmmaker Peter Jackson. Billy goes on to say, when Peter Jackson did the film Get Back, where it was us making the Let It Be album, he was able to extricate John's voice from a ropey little bit of cassette and a piano. He could separate them with artificial intelligence. They tell the machine, or the AI, that's a voice, this is a guitar, lose the guitar. So Billy continues by saying, so when we came to make what will be the last Beatles record, it was a demo that John had that we worked on and we just finished it up. It will be released this year. He also goes on to say, there is a good side to the technology, but also a scary side. We will have to see where that leads. And then I ask the question, what's next? Deep fakes of the lads in the studio writing and recording? You can bet your bottom dollar that that's going to happen. Okay, so while we're talking about Peter Jackson, let's go to another article that was sent to me by Laurie about how Peter Jackson's film Get Back, according to Billy, did indeed change the historical narrative. Let's take a look. Okay, so I would like to again thank Laurie for passing this story along. And going back to August of 2021, I did a presentation titled, Is Peter Jackson's Get Back Revising Beatle History? And I put that presentation out before Peter released his documentary, Get Back. And the reason why I did my presentation was because I knew that Jackson's Get Back documentary was going to be an attempt to revise history, to be a retelling of that period of time in Beatles history, which was plagued by tension, stress, and acrimony. And this is well documented in the many books that have been written, and we can also go back to the original Let It Be film by Michael Lindsay Hogg, and we can see it for ourselves. So when Peter released his trailer for his Get Back documentary, and I was watching the interaction with the Beatles, all the backslapping and all that stuff, I thought to myself, okay, I see what's going on here. So I felt compelled to put my presentation together to preserve the history. And that's why I did it. And I also surmised that the reason why this was getting done, the motivation for it, goes back to Billy. Because he wants the Beatles to be pristine. He doesn't want the Beatles story to be tainted with any negativity. Everything has to be positive and shiny. So they tapped Peter Jackson to put that story together, the revised story. So let's take a look at what the article says. Pop culture never quite recovered from the Beatles breaking up in 1970 with McCartney's alleged bossiness blamed for the breakup. And it's interesting, they talk about pop culture. But in 2021, Peter Jackson's brilliant remake of the Beatles' Get Back documentary changed that narrative. It showed never-before-seen footage of the band working together on their 1969 album, Let It Be. It painted a dramatically different picture of the events, even for McCartney himself. And then they have a quote from Billy. I had kind of ended up buying into this idea that, you know, poor all of the three, and I'm just bossing them around. But when I saw the film, I'm thinking, no, I'm not. It's okay. It's just us in the studio and a lockbox in there. Everyone's kind of happy to work like that. It just made me feel really good about that whole period. So you see, he wanted it to be happy. Now, before we leave this slide, I want to call out a couple of things. In the Let It Be documentary, we see the wall has the colors of the rainbow, and the rainbow represents Lucifer. And Billy is sitting underneath the purple color. And purple represents the crown chakra, which represents illumination and enlightenment. So even in a simple picture like this, it's all encoded with occultism. Okay, so with that, let's swing back to Vivian Stanshall and take a look at a couple of slides. Okay, so this is an image of an article that was sent my way, and I posted it to my YouTube community tab going back a few months ago. And it's an article written by Vivian Stanshall. And Stanshall is a character that was invented by Billy, and Billy played the character in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Now, there was another Vivian Stanshall that was on Billy's payroll, and his first name was Victor. That's the version of Stanshall that you're going to read on Wikipedia that passed away in 1995. And what's crazy about this article is Billy, through his Vivian Stanshall character, is explaining how he was able to have his McCartney and Stanshall character coexist, and he's also explaining how he brought Victor into the fold. Okay, so let me read this excerpt. I dreamt that I became so incredibly famous, his Paul McCartney role, and had to do so many public appearances that I no longer had any private life at all. So his private life would include his ability to play his Vivian Stanshall character in the Bonzo Dog Band. So one day, I stopped a geezer of the same height and build and offered him a fortune if he would undergo plastic surgery to make him look like me and cut my responsibilities in half. And so he did. There you go, folks. Again, hidden in plain sight. So with that, what I'm going to do now is to take you through a couple of slides where I do some Stanshall, Billy, McCartney compares. Okay, so let's go to the first one and take a look at Billy's facial profile. Okay, so the slides that I'm going to show you are all in my Stanshall presentation, which I think goes back to 2019. I will leave a link down below in the description box. So we have two images. On the left is Stanshall, on the right is Billy in his McCartney role. So the first thing we want to do is to take a look at the slope to the forehead. And if we go to the picture on the left of Stanshall, that's labeled number 1, take a look at the slope of the forehead. And we have that same slope here in the image on the right of Billy in his McCartney role. And then take a look at the nasal bridge, number 2, right here. See how that's curved right there? Take a look. We have the same curve at the nasal bridge with Billy as McCartney. And then note the nasal ridge, which is number 3. So take a look at the slope of the nose on Stanshall, and then take a look at the slope of the nose with Billy. There's going to be a very slight difference because Billy has had nose surgery. But that's very, very close. And then number 4 is the jawline. So take a look at the jawline. The bottom of the ear going toward the chin. It's the same jawline. All right. So let's move to slide number 29 and take a look at the resemblance between Billy in his Stanshall role without his mustache and comparing him to his son James. Okay, so in memoirs, Billy tells us that his son James looks very much like he did when he was younger. So, image number 1 is Billy in his Stanshall role, and he has no mustache. And take a look at image number 2. This is his son James. We can see the family resemblance. James's nose is more like Linda's. But if we take a look at the eyes, the face, they look like father and son. Image number 3 is Billy again in his Stanshall role, just at a slightly different angle. And image number 4, again, is an image of James McCartney. So, I don't know about you, but they certainly look like father and son to me. Let's move to the next slide and let's compare Stanshall to biological Paul McCartney. Okay, so the first 3 images I showed earlier in the presentation when I was taking everybody through Billy's eyes. And to recap, he's blind in his right eye. And in the first 3 pictures on this slide, we can see his right eye is looking straight forward. And his left eye, which is the eye that he sees with, is drifting slightly to the left in each of the first 3 images. So image number 1 is Billy in his Stanshall role with the Bonzo Dog Band. Image number 2 is Billy in his McCartney role. And image number 3 is Billy also in his McCartney role, but obviously he's a lot older. But the first 3 images are the same person. Image number 4 is biological Paul. And so I asked the question, which face doesn't belong? Maybe the guy with 2 good eyes and a rounder face? This is why Sally's discovery of Billy having an artificial eye is so important, because it's hard evidence that the guy playing Paul McCartney today, and who has been in the role since late 1966, is not the original Paul McCartney. And so with that, let's move to slide number 31 and take a look at Billy's toes. Okay, so the image on the left was sent to me by either Vicky or Sally. And when I looked at it, I looked at Billy's feet, and you can see that I put a red circle around his left foot. And when I was looking at it, I was counting the toes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm looking at the side of his foot, and I'm thinking, is that a toe? What's going on over there? So if we look at the image at the top right of the slide, I zoomed in on his left foot, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 toes. But again, we have this kind of this space right here. So what is that? So I took this top image and I ran it through a software program I have that cleans up images. And the bottom right is the result. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we have this area over here. So it appears that he does have 5 toes. But I was questioning whether there was a 6th toe at one time, and perhaps it was surgically removed. Just a thought. If we take a look at the top center image, that's a close-up of biological Paul McCartney's feet. And we can see he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 toes, but his foot also appears to be a bit narrower than Billy's feet. So I took the top image and I ran it through my software program to see how much I can clean it up, and the result is the bottom center image. And the program did a good job of making things a little clearer. So 5 toes for sure, but what I don't see is this part of the foot next to the pinky toe, where on Billy it protrudes out, and I'm pointing to the bottom right image, and then moving to the bottom center image. I'm not seeing that. Yes, it's a different angle, but I don't know. Even at this angle, the bottom center, I think you might see a little something on the side of the foot that looks like what we see here on the bottom right. So what I'm thinking, not the same feet, but I'll let you decide. Okay, last slide. I'm going to show you some more social engineering, and this time it's an article that came out of AARP, which is a magazine for retired folks in the United States, and the article is talking about 50 years of hip-hop. Let's go there now. Okay, so what I'm going to take you through is a great example of how social engineering works. And this particular article comes from a recent AARP magazine, which is a magazine in the United States for retired people. And the article was celebrating 50 years of hip-hop. So let me start by reading the first paragraph, and then I'll break it down. It all started on August 11th, 1973. An 18-year-old Clive Campbell and his younger sister Cindy hosted a dance party billed as a back-to-school jam in the rec room of an apartment complex at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, New York. These details are now the stuff of legend. Now, the article goes on to say that hip-hop became a worldwide movement, and it's a perfect example of propaganda. In fact, AARP, in any issue, is loaded up with stuff that is meant to condition the minds of the elderly. So the article goes on to tell us that hip-hop began on August 11th, 1973. The date reduces to the number 3. Then it tells us an 18-year-old Clive Campbell and his sister Cindy hosted a dance party. That one sentence is loaded up with numerology. An 18-year-old, 1 plus 8 equals 9. Clive Campbell, his initials are CC. C equals 3 in numerology, so we have 33, which also reduces to 6, and if we multiply 3 times 3, we get 9. And it's the same thing with his sister Cindy, CC. So we have 3, 6, and 9 numerology. Very important numbers in the occult. Then the article goes on to say, the details are now the stuff of legend. Now, most people would read this article as is, no critical thinking, and just absorb all of the conditioning and the propaganda that's being fed to them. But a critical mind might ask the following questions. How would anyone know, 1, about this party, and 2, definitively establish that a party in a Bronx apartment was the beginning of hip-hop? It's a completely contrived narrative created by social engineers, like the ones over at Tavistock. So hip-hop is a manufactured, quote, lifestyle and genre of music, which ultimately led to rap. Okay, so with that, I'm going to conclude this presentation with a montage of Beatles occult symbolism, played to Tomorrow Never Knows in reverse. Thanks for listening.